Picture this. You're standing in Australia, but it's not the Australia you know. No kangaroos, no koalas, no emus scratching through the dust. Instead, something is watching you from the tree line. Something the size of a car. A wombat. Not the round, sleepy creature you've seen in videos. This one weighs 3 tons. It stands chest high to a grown man. And it's not alone. 50,000 years ago, Australia was running a completely different program. The continent was home to the largest marsupials that ever walked the earth. Diprotodon, a wombat the size of a rhinoceros, grazed across open plains that stretched for hundreds of miles. Procoptodon, a kangaroo that stood 10 feet tall. It weighed 500 pounds. It moved through forests that no longer exist. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, crouched in the branches above you. It had retractable claws, and it had the strongest bite of any mammal, pound for pound. Megalania, a monitor lizard 20 feet long. Heavier than a grizzly bear, it hunted across the continent for millions of years. These were not myths. These were not exaggerations. Their bones are still in the ground. Australia had been isolated for 45 million years, cut off from every other landmass on Earth. It ran its own evolutionary experiment, completely separate from the rest of the world. No lions, no wolves, no bears. The predators that shaped life on every other continent never set foot here. So life here went in a different direction entirely. Marsupials filled every ecological role that placental mammals filled everywhere else. And they filled them at a scale that is hard to wrap your head around. For millions of years, this system was stable. These animals had survived ice ages. They had survived drought. They had survived volcanic shifts that rewrote the landscape. The megafauna of Australia were not fragile. They were ancient. They were proven. They had been running the same successful program for so long. Nothing on the continent could threaten them. And then something arrived that the continent had never seen before. Not a predator with claws, not a virus, not an asteroid. Something far more dangerous than any of those things. Something that had already quietly emptied the megafauna from every other continent it had touched. Something that carried fire in one hand and a spear in the other. The first Australians stepped onto that continent roughly 50,000 years ago, and nothing would ever be the same. For millions of years, if you wanted to understand what Australia looked like, you had to think bigger. Much bigger. Diprotodon optatum was the largest marsupial that ever lived. 3 tons of solid animal, moving in herds across the open savanna of Central Australia. Scientists have found their remains in such concentration at certain sites that researchers believe they gathered in groups, the way elephants do today. They were grazers, slow, unhurried. They had no reason to be afraid. Nothing on the continent could bring one down. They had existed in some form for over 1.5 million years. They were as permanent a feature of the Australian landscape as the red rock itself. Procoptodon goliath, the giant short-faced kangaroo, stood 10 feet tall at full height. It had eyes that faced forward like a predator, not sideways like prey. Its single large toe on each foot worked like a hoof. It could reach branches 12 feet off the ground and pull them down with specialized shortened arms, built for exactly that purpose. It moved across the landscape with an efficiency that no modern kangaroo can match. Researchers estimate it could cover ground at speeds that would make a modern Olympic sprinter look slow. And then there was Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion. Pound for pound, it had the most powerful bite of any mammal ever measured. Stronger than a modern lion. Stronger than a hyena. Its teeth were not designed for crushing bone. They were designed for something more efficient. Shearing. A single bite could cut through muscle and organ simultaneously. Its claws were retractable, like a cat's, but larger. Fossil evidence shows it was capable of climbing trees and likely ambushed prey from above. For smaller animals, there was no warning. There was no second chance. Megalania prisca was something out of a nightmare. A monitor lizard that reached lengths of up to 20 feet and may have weighed over 1,000 pounds. It was almost certainly venomous, the same way its closest living relative, the Komodo dragon, is venomous today. It moved the way large reptiles move. Patient, deliberate, capable of explosive speed over short distances. It had been hunting across Australia for hundreds of thousands of years before the first human ever set eyes on the continent. These animals were not struggling. They were not in decline. The fossil record shows healthy, stable populations spread across the continent right up until a very specific and very sudden moment in time. That moment has a name, and it arrived on 2 legs. Here's what the science actually shows. Not the comfortable version, the real one. When the first humans arrived in Australia roughly 50,000 years ago, they brought something the continent had never encountered. Not disease, not invasive species, something more fundamental than either of those things. They brought a mind that could plan across time, A mind that could look at an animal it had never seen before and understand instinctively exactly how to kill it. This is the part that matters. The megafauna of Australia had no fear of humans. None. They had never seen a bipedal predator carrying a spear. They had never learned to run from something that walked upright. Thylacoleo had spent millions of years at the top of the food chain. Diprotodon had spent millions of years with nothing on the continent, capable of threatening a herd animal that weighed 3 tons. Their survival instincts were calibrated for a world that did not include us. Paleontologist Tim Flannery called this the naivety effect. Animals that evolve in isolation from human hunters have no inherited fear of them. The same pattern played out in New Zealand when humans arrived around 1280 AD. The moa, a flightless bird that stood 12 feet tall and weighed 500 pounds, walked directly toward the people who would kill it. On Madagascar, the elephant bird did the same. On every island, on every continent where humans arrived late, the story repeated with almost mechanical consistency. The animals didn't run, and the animals died. The timeline in Australia is brutal in its precision. Researchers analyzing fossil sites across the continent found that the disappearances didn't happen gradually over millions of years, the way natural extinctions typically do. They clustered. Site after site shows the same pattern. Megafauna present. Humans arrive. Megafauna gone. In geological terms, the gap between those two events is almost nothing. Within roughly 10,000 years of human arrival, 46 of Australia's 50 known megafauna species were extinct. 46 out of 50. Diprotodon was gone. Procoptodon was gone. Thylacoleo was gone. Megalania was gone. The giant flightless bird Geniornis, which had survived every climate shift the continent had thrown at it for millions of years, disappeared. Researchers found their eggshells at ancient human campsites, burned. Some scientists argue that climate change played a role, and it did. Australia was drying out. Vegetation patterns were shifting. But climate had shifted before, many times, without triggering mass extinction. The one variable that was new, the one thing that had never been present in any of the previous climate shifts, was us. We didn't just hunt these animals, we hunted them in a landscape where they had no idea what we were. Here's the part that is hardest to sit with. This was not a story about villains. The people who arrived in Australia 50,000 years ago were not destroyers. They were survivors. They were doing exactly what humans have always done, finding food, feeding their children, following the animals across a landscape that was richer than anything their ancestors had ever seen. They had no concept of extinction. The idea that a species could disappear forever, that an animal so large and so ancient could simply stop existing, was not part of any framework available to the human mind at that point in history. You cannot mourn something you have no category for. And yet the math is unforgiving. A single family group hunting one Diprotodon every few months would not have felt like destruction. It would have felt like a good season. But Diprotodon reproduced slowly, the way all large animals do. One offspring every few years, long pregnancies, extended juvenile periods. A species like that can absorb natural predation because natural predation evolved alongside it over millions of years, calibrated to a rate the population could sustain. Human hunting was not calibrated to anything. It was simply effective. And effective, applied consistently across generations, becomes extinction. Researchers estimate that the entire megafauna collapse in Australia may have been triggered by a human population that never exceeded a few thousand people. A few thousand people spread across a continent the size of the continental United States hunting animals that had never learned to run with weapons sharp enough to do the job. The scale of what was lost is almost impossible to process. 46 species. Gone. Each one representing millions of years of evolutionary history. Each one filling an ecological role that nothing alive today has replaced. The continent that exists now is a shadow of what it was. The grasslands that Diprotodon maintained through grazing collapsed into scrubland. The predator-prey dynamics that Thylacoleo kept in balance unraveled. The entire ecological architecture of Australia was rebuilt from scratch in the absence of the animals that had shaped it for millions of years. The Australia you see in documentaries today, the Red Desert, the sparse vegetation, the relatively small and cautious fauna, is not the default state of the continent. It is the aftermath. And here's why this matters to you right now today, in 2026. Because the pattern did not stop in Australia, it moved. To North America, where horses, mammoths, and giant ground sloths vanished within a few thousand years of human arrival. To South America, to Madagascar, to New Zealand. Everywhere the pattern was the same. We arrived, the giants disappeared, we are still arriving, the megafauna are still disappearing. The mechanism is different now. It is habitat and warming and the 10,000 invisible pressures of a civilization that consumes everything it touches. But the outcome rhymes. We are still the most dangerous thing that ever walked into a landscape that wasn't ready for us. We always were. The difference is that now we know it. And knowing it, the only question that actually matters is what we decide to do next.